What they never do is start with the design argument and say, here's this argument that proves a God's existence, and move from there towards the reality of their particular God. Because if they did that, they'd see the entire construct for the parts it's made of, like the psychological need for explanations and various bits of preceding mythologies. Welcome to Noah's Snark. I'm Atheist Josephina, kicking off Season 2 of this podcast. And today I'm finally getting around to an episode I've been wanting to do for a very long time. I'm taking on a very popular argument for the existence of God known as the design argument and exposing its numerous flaws. In short, today I'm going to show you why the design argument is a complete and utter failure. In monotheism, the argument from design for God's existence, which is one of the teleological arguments because it assumes a purpose, attempts to posit that the complexity of the universe is much like that of a machine or some other human artifact, and in being so, can only have been created by an omnipotent and omniscient designer, and that being is God, typically assumed to be the Abrahamic God. The medieval thinker St. Thomas Aquinas was particularly fond of this argument, and it's gone through several iterations thanks to 17th and 18th century writers like Samuel Clarke and William Paley. Unsurprisingly, since its inception, the argument from design has been criticized by notable philosophers like David Hume. There are other criticisms besides his, of course, and I'll review those before moving on to an often overlooked criticism. At any rate, as a simple syllogism, the general argument from design is often laid out like so. And keep in mind, as I go over the argument, the language used, especially in premise 1, which will be important later. Premise 1. The universe exhibits intricate design and functionality similar to human-designed artifacts like a watch. Premise 2. Design, especially complex design, which is implied in premise 1, is most likely the result of intelligent agency. Conclusion, therefore, an intelligent designer, that being God, must exist. To begin with, Scottish philosopher David Hume pointed out that if complex existent things require a designer, so too must the designer have a designer. To stop at God as the designer of the universe is arbitrary reasoning, and today is often pointed out as being a case of the logical fallacy known as special pleading, where the thing one is arguing for is an exception to the rule they're arguing for. For example, many apologists like to claim that the universe can't be eternal, but that God can be, and this is mostly due to arbitrary definitions. For example, what eternal means isn't clear or agreed upon among apologists. Regardless, they have no evidence for their assertions. Anyway, the real problem with their eternal God argument is that even if God were eternal, all that means is that at least one thing is eternal. There may be more. Perhaps the universe is eternal, and if we were to assert the universe were eternal, we'd have the same amount of evidence for that assertion as theists have for their assertion that God is eternal. Theists also try to work around Hume's basic criticism by trying to be more precise and saying, well, everything that begins to exist has a cause, and God never began to exist. Well, number one, there's no law of the universe that says a cause must have intelligent agency behind it, and two, we don't know if the universe actually had a beginning. We don't know the state of the universe before inflation, which came before the Big Bang. And three, we likewise don't know if God exists, did or did not have a beginning. No one would know that, especially if a believer is going to posit God as a being outside of time and space as we know it, since we have no access to such a realm or dimension. David Hume also argued that likening the universe to a human-made machine is a weak analogy. The universe may display order, but it does not display design. With any evidence of a design, being things not found in nature, and that there are alternative explanations other than concluding God's existence, as we'll see. Author and educator George H. Smith developed this criticism of the design argument's analogy, drawing a distinction between how we know what is designed and what is not. More on that later. Returning to Hume, Hume reasoned that extrapolating from a part to the whole to the entirety of the universe was a fallacy of composition, meaning that it would be an error to assume that because individual parts of the universe have a certain characteristic, like needing a cause, the universe as a whole must also have that same characteristic, especially as we only have experience with a limited part of the universe. Moreover, you can't make a general claim about the whole universe being designed, just cherry-picking the bits that work and seem designed while ignoring the bits that don't seem designed. All that considered, Hume said you can't generalize from the parts to the whole without further justification. Now back to William Paley here. If we're being generous as to his thought process and trying to avoid Hume's criticism of his analogy, Paley made an implied deductive argument which can be construed like this. 1. Anything that has several parts arranged for a purpose, for example a watch, is designed. 2. The eye and other things in nature have several parts arranged for a purpose. 3. Therefore the eye and other things in nature are designed. 4. Anything that is designed must have a designer. 5. Therefore the eye and other things in nature have a designer. 6. Conclusion, this designer is God. But we can easily attack this, especially the first premise, as we've never seen something like the elements or parts of a human being be designed by an intelligent agent, and can make the case that those parts, as well as the human being in its entirety, developed solely through natural processes. Worse, there is no reason to assume the designer of all things, whether they be parts or the entirety of an artifact, is the same designer or lone designer, which is exactly what Paley does in his implied argument, entirely because he has presuppositions about his God. If God did exist, it may not be in the way Paley supposes. It could be the case that this designer abandoned its creation after the creation of the universe's most fundamental particles, like quarks and leptons a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. There would be no need to guide the evolution of the universe or be involved in its workings beyond that point, and God could have easily left itself to work itself out. But that's just speculation on my part. Speculation that's evidentially equivalent to the idea that God is intimately involved in the mechanisms of the universe. That aside, Voltaire and Immanuel Kant, although both agreeing the design argument does make a case for something like a grand architect, both criticize the argument for falling short and showing this architect to be some kind of all-powerful being. I will posit an overlooked particular criticism along this line of thought, as well as attack that lone designer presupposition I mentioned earlier in a little bit. Anyway, considering this criticism of the design argument by Voltaire and Kant, but taking into account not all apologists subscribe to the presuppositions of omnipotence and omniscience, I would nonetheless contend that most monotheistic apologists presume an all-knowing and all-powerful God in relation to the second premise, which is, remember, design, especially complex design, which is implied in premise 1, is most likely the result of intelligent agency. We might as well point out here that it's not known how much knowledge and or power or energy is necessary for any intelligent agent to design and create a universe. In fact, depending on what formula one uses to calculate the total amount of energy in the universe, one either arrives at zero, meaning it's constant, or there are 1 times 10 to the 69th joules of energy in the universe. Now, don't ask me for the formulas, I had to look them up. At any rate, the energy of the universe is not infinite, and therefore would not require infinite power in its creation. Thus, it would be reasonable to assume that any individual, assuming they've never heard of the Abrahamic God, but knowing there is a finite amount of energy in the universe, would not read the overall design argument as it's laid out and conclude a single being of infinite power and knowledge exists as the universe's designer or creator. It's reasonable to assume, though, that in our day and age, a very large percentage of people who use the design argument for the existence of God believed in God prior to ever hearing the design argument, and that's why they presuppose God's attributes. That doesn't necessarily mean the design argument is false, but it certainly doesn't strengthen its case. Some critics have pointed to other flaws in the design argument, among them being the vast majority of the universe's environment is hostile to human life, and that there is no need for the universe to be so large, given that human beings will most likely never traverse its vast distances. We might even point out here that random occurrences such as virtual particles and spontaneous radioactive decay would intuitively seem not to be a feature of a designed artifact, since they don't seem to serve any particular purpose. Though in being generous, I think spontaneous radioactive decay could be argued to be a feature of a designed universe, but I don't see how the same could be said for virtual particles. And if you don't know what virtual particles are, please look it up. Another criticism is that proponents of the design argument cannot say what an undesigned universe might look like. That ruins any basis for comparison and weakens the design argument's first premise. Somewhere along that line of thought, I would find it strange, if I didn't know anything about human psychology, that many proponents of the design argument never point to artifacts that are obviously undesigned, something in nature like a head of cabbage, and only point to artifacts such as, say, an arrowhead to draw an analogy to a designed universe. On that note, and getting back to Paley for a moment, he did seem to believe everything, whether or not it had any utility for people, had a purpose, though I think he used a watch as his example to develop his version of the design argument for a very obvious reason, that being a watch is obviously designed and is a relatively simple artifact. Now let's get to a more specific and stronger criticism regarding the second premise. Question: how do we know what things are designed and what things are not, that is, undesigned? Answer: we've seen people design and make things that do not resemble anything found in nature. A camera has an altogether different design and composition than an animal's eye, even if the most basic concept is preserved. The tools that human beings create generally do not resemble natural artifacts, or at least they don't any longer, differing from the tools of prehistoric man who used stones or animal bones as tools, or tools fashioned from animal bones. Even in cases where humans are trying to mimic an animal's design, for example, insect-like drones that can pollinate plants, these designed artifacts obviously fall short of the complexity and effectiveness of their natural counterparts. But even if human beings could completely mimic nature, they would still have used unnatural-looking designed tools to achieve those ends. Given the exponential growth of technology, it's probable human beings will be able to create very lifelike robots, perhaps indistinguishable from the real thing, but again, think of the tools that will be used in that process. They will look nothing like anything found in nature. Moreover, think of the designers in this case of creating a lifelike robot. Are they omnipotent or omniscient or both? Can a single person build a lifelike robot without having the benefit of the intellectual giants and engineers that came before them? No and no. What we do know about designed artifacts, particularly if they are complex, is that the more complex a created thing is, the more designers and more builders are needed in the fabrication of that thing. Here, I want you to notice the word selection that was used in premise 1 of the design argument, which was, the universe exhibits intricate design and functionality similar to a human-designed artifact like a watch. Apologists like to use this verbiage because they know a watch can be designed and created by a single person. With that in mind, yes, even a simple hut could be designed by a single designer who also builds that hut. Hypothetically, given enough time and resources, a single designer could also design and build a modern small office building. Though, especially in the case of a small modern office building, not without tools other people have made and materials others have provided. Now think of a city. No single person designs and builds an entire city. No single entity even has enough knowledge, time, or resources to do that. Now, is a county more complex than a city? Is a state a more complex system than a county? Is an entire country a more complex system than a state? Do you see where I'm going with this? I would also revisit the point here that none of these kinds of things require omnipotence or omniscience in their design or construction. What with there being a finite amount of energy in the universe, any so-called designer, again, need not be omnipotent. All of this is to stop and give us pause and ponder for a moment what we could infer by granting Voltaire and Kant their architect verbiage. It wouldn't be so much a single architect, but more likely multiple architects, multiple designers, multiple builders, and even suppliers. While there might be a project manager in the grand scheme of planning a city, city planning is typically run by committee and not a single person. It would be important to once again note here that the reason theists believe their creator of the universe is omnipotent and omniscient is because that was in their definition of God prior to the formulation of the design argument or ever hearing about it. They cannot get to their conclusion of an omnipotent and omniscient God by reading the design argument first ahead of any belief in God and God's attributes. Worse, the design argument, even in accepting its premises, in no way points to any specific God, just that a God exists, even though what they should be concluding, if anything, is that gods exist based on what we know about how things are designed and built. Therefore, in the design argument's best case scenario, it would be an argument for polytheism, not monotheism. The argument's premises simply do not get us to a single designer and builder, not when we consider what we know about the differences between designed and natural artifacts, especially as designed artifacts become more complex. That said, I believe we can formulate the design argument, if it's going to be used, much more accurately like this. Premise 1. The universe exhibits intricate design and functionality similar to human-designed artifacts like a city. For the sake of argument, I'm granting the premise as reasonable enough to be accepted. Also note that I used a more complex example than a watch, which was used in the original formulation of this argument. Premise 2. Design, that is, complex design implied in premise 1, is most likely the result of intelligent agents, plural. Conclusion. Therefore, a multitude of intelligent designers must exist. The design argument, if accepted, is an argument for polytheism, not monotheism, because of what we know about what is required for the designing and building of complex artifacts or systems. Could it be the case that God, the head of the divine council referred to early in the Bible, was a sort of project manager for creating the universe, Basically the Elon Musk of gods. Maybe, I don't know, but the important thing is to realize that given what we know about designed things, God most likely didn't do it by himself if God had any hand in it at all. Which brings us to some objections in a moment, but first I want to address the issue of complexity real quick, since I didn't see a good opportunity to mention it earlier. Inherent in the design argument, but not often talked about, is the issue of complexity creating less complexity. We know that regardless of the designed artifact or system, it appears only something more complicated than the artifact or system can be its architect. At least that's our only experience of how designed things get designed. A beaver dam is made by beavers, which are more complicated things than the beaver dam. A car is always made by humans, which are more complicated things than the car. If God is the designer of the universe, it stands to reason that God is a more complicated thing than the universe. Then the question arises, what's the more complex thing that created God? To which the apologists will immediately invoke special pleading to say this argument doesn't apply to God for various reasons. They might simply allege with no evidence whatsoever that God is uncreated. Okay, let's put that aside. Let me address some other objections. More than once I've heard from apologists that I'm placing human limitations on their omnipotent God, or anthropomorphizing God with this polytheistic argument. Okay, let's talk about God's limitations first. The Bible states early in Genesis, we're created in God's image, so it would be reasonable to assume we function in some capacities like that being, even if we're not at God's level of authority, power, or knowledge. Being like God in any respect means the converse as well. God is, in some sense, a being like us, and this could suggest that God has limitations, even if God's able to do some things we can't, or say, is limited to being able to do things that are logically possible, as some apologists argue. It's obvious God has limitations anyway, at least according to the Bible. For example, he's not able to curtail his deep sorrow, his regret with early humanity's creation, and subsequently decides to drown everyone except Noah and his family. With the inability to control your emotions, a common limitation, a common attribute of human beings. That, and that God can't or just won't forgive Adam and Eve's disobedience, tells us there are limitations to God's forgiveness. There is even God's weakness against iron implied in Judges chapter 1, verse 19, a verse that requires your typical apologetic mental gymnastics to defend God's omnipotence. The only defense an apologist has against placing limitations on God is once again the presumption that God has sufficient or requisite power and knowledge to do something like create a universe, which, 1, simply has never been demonstrated, and 2, is something we're not currently able to do as we lack sufficient power and knowledge. But that doesn't mean we'll never be able to do it. When and if we do, should we be considered gods? Because that seems to be what it takes to be considered a god, have the power to create a universe and by extension the life that populates it. Have you ever played the game The Sims? Does playing that game make the player a god? We should also recognize that apologists anthropomorphize God by describing him as a designer, making accusations of anthropomorphizing God in the way I've done hypocritical. You may have noticed how apologists characterize God with preferred pronouns because of the type of human-like relationship an allegedly incorporeal God wants to have with us. Whether it's the kind of relationship God wants to have with us or implying God designed anything demonstrates that God thinks, acts, or behaves like we do, and vice versa to some degree. I would add to that God must be limited as there's no such thing as an unlimited capacity to think or an unlimited possession of power, at least as far as anyone can tell. For instance, we might ask if God can think of 10 billion different things at once, and maybe God can, but we can't know that. It can't be demonstrated. That would simply be a presupposition of God's attributes. I can't take the criticism of anthropomorphizing God seriously when believers do it all the time. Apologists in all the Abrahamic faiths, not just Christians, but mostly Muslims too, often use design arguments as a proof for God's existence when, again, at best, they should be saying it's a proof for a God's existence. But they don't do that because they've already presupposed their God does exist and everything they want to think about their God is true. What they never do is start with the design argument and say, here's this argument that proves a God's existence, and move from there towards the reality of their particular God. Because if they did that, they'd see the entire construct for the parts it's made of, like the psychological need for explanations and various bits of preceding mythologies. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but there's an almost complete disconnect there. On top of that, apologists want to believe their God is involved in the workings of the universe at all times too, adding something of an extra unspoken importance to the design argument, because for the average apologist, it can't be the case that God created and designed the universe, then simply left the universe to attend to itself. Apologists are very much opposed to such an idea. I suppose because without God actively involved in their lives, who would empower them or tell them that they're special? I admit I'm speculating here. Meanwhile, yes, there are some agnostics that think maybe it might be the case that God created the universe and left it to do its thing, but there seems to be very few people who take that position. All of these criticisms aside, could I be convinced the design argument has any merit? Yes. Let me explain. Apologists often say unthoughtful things like, atheists believe everything came from nothing. How do you think everything got here, silly atheist? When everything, especially God, coming from nothing or existing eternally is literally the position of the believer. As I'm fond of asking in reference to their position of a universe created ex nihilo, what materials and methods did God use to create the universe? I could be convinced of God's existence if this could be explained to me, preferably by God, who allegedly has the ability to make me understand it, since that would be in the realm of those things logically possible God could do if God exists. Go ahead and convince me, Almighty God. I'm not challenging you, I'm humbly asking you. But if God doesn't exist in reality, I can't expect God to do that, can I? As it stands, permutations of the design argument are among the best arguments apologists have for the possibility of a God or a God's existence. But even so, they're crap arguments. If God's existence is so obvious as many apologists contend, why is this the case? This should tell you something about the chances of any God actually existing. If you enjoyed this episode and this kind of content, please consider subscribing. For Noah's Snark, I'm Atheist Josephina, aka AJV. Until next time, revel in reason and love the logical.